Life stories. Professor tried to humiliate him, but he solved what graduate students couldn't. It was a setup meant to humble him, to make him stumble in front of the entire class. But when he solved a problem even graduate students struggled with, the room saw Professor Janet Miller in a whole new light. The large lecture hall at the University of Chicago was buzzing with the usual morning chatter. Students were settling into their seats, flipping through notebooks, firing up laptops, and preparing for another grueling session of advanced calculus. It was just another Tuesday morning, the kind that every student dreaded, especially those enrolled in Professor Miller's class. Known for her rigorous teaching style and unforgiving approach, this class was as much a challenge as it was a rite of passage. Professor Miller, a tall, sharp woman with auburn hair pulled back into a tight bun, entered the room with the confidence of someone who knew her authority was absolute. She wore a tailored suit, and her silver-rimmed glasses gave her an air of unapproachable precision. The moment she stepped to the front of the room, everything fell silent. Students braced themselves for the lesson they had learned to fear: detailed, complex, and unyielding. "Good morning," she said, as her heels clicked against the tiled floor, the sound echoing through the lecture hall. Without missing a beat, she snapped a piece of chalk in half between her fingers and approached the board. "We'll be diving into Laplace transforms today," she continued, her voice authoritative. "Last week we covered multivariable limits, and I trust you remember the basics. No excuses for falling behind." With a single motion, she began writing a long series of intricate equations, the symbols flowing perfectly in neat, flawless script. Some students scrambled to keep up, while others tried to pretend they understood, their pens scratching across notebooks. Professor Miller thrived in this environment: the struggle, the tension, the competition. She had built a reputation on pushing her students to the brink. If you could keep up, you deserved to be there. If you couldn't, then you weren't cut out for her world. In the middle of the lecture hall sat a student named Marcus Taylor. Tall, lean, with short black hair and an unassuming demeanor, Marcus didn't attract much attention. He wore a simple hoodie and jeans, blending in with the other students, but his mind worked at lightning speed. Numbers and equations flowed through his head effortlessly, patterns and solutions coming to him in a way they didn't for most of his peers. As the professor wrote, Marcus casually glanced at the board. His eyes quickly scanned the equation. There was something off, a small mistake, just a minor oversight, but an error nonetheless. Most of the class was too absorbed in taking notes to notice, but Marcus couldn't ignore it. He could let it slide, let the lecture continue without anyone being the wiser, but if he did, and the mistake was caught later, it would derail the entire lesson. Before he could decide whether or not to speak up, a voice from the front row interrupted his thoughts.
"Professor Miller, I think there's a mistake in the second line," a nervous voice called out. It was Sarah, a student who often sat near the front. Her face flushed red as she raised her hand hesitantly. Professor Miller's expression hardened immediately. She turned slowly, eyeing Sarah like a hawk. Mistake?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "There is no mistake," she said flatly. "You must be misinterpreting the math." Sarah's face flushed even deeper, and she quickly looked down embarrassed. The rest of the class shifted uncomfortably, and Marcus felt the familiar twinge of frustration. He hated the way some professors treated their students, how they dismissed their concerns with such cold certainty. Before he could stop himself, Marcus's hand shot into the air. "Actually, Professor Miller," he said, his voice calm, "there is a mistake." A ripple of surprise went through the room. Heads turned toward him, some students exchanging glances, others waiting for the inevitable showdown. Professor Miller's eyes narrowed, her lips tightening, but she didn't show any outward sign of anger, at least not yet. "Oh," she said, crossing her arms, "enlighten me, Marcus." Marcus stood up, not out of arrogance or to make a spectacle, but simply because he didn't like speaking from a seated position. He walked to the front of the room, taking the chalk from Professor Miller's hand. "The issue is in the second step," he explained. "You applied the transformation to the wrong term. The coefficient doesn't carry over that way. If you use the correct method, the final result matches the expected answer." There was a pause as Professor Miller's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She turned back to the board, scanning the equations with a critical eye, trying to find the mistake. Then, after a few seconds of tense silence, it happened. She found it. The mistake. For a moment, Marcus thought she might admit it and move on, but instead, Professor Miller's lips curled into a tight, almost imperceptible smile. "Well, Marcus, since you're so confident, why don't you come up here and show us the correct way?" A few students chuckled under their breath, the tension in the room palpable. It was clear Professor Miller didn't want to admit she was wrong. She wanted to put Marcus on the spot, force him to hesitate, make him stumble. She wanted to see if he would crack. But Marcus wasn't going to play by her rules. He set his notebook down and walked calmly to the front of the room. As he took the chalk, the energy in the room shifted. He wasn't nervous. If anything, he felt more focused than ever.
He spoke as he worked, his voice casual. "The issue is how the transform was applied. You carried the coefficient outside too early, which changed the limits of integration. If you solve it this way, it keeps the function intact." The room was completely silent, save for the soft scratch of chalk against the board. She wasn't happy about being corrected, especially not in front of the entire class. She scanned his work, looking for any errors, any small mistake she could use to discredit him. But there was nothing. He had solved it, not only correctly, but elegantly. "Well," she said after a long pause, her voice colder than before, "you corrected it. Congratulations." Some students exchanged glances, but there was no applause, no real acknowledgement of his accomplishment. Marcus didn't need that. He returned to his seat quietly, aware of the eyes that followed him. Some students looked at him with admiration, others with irritation. But he wasn't concerned with their opinions. He was just focused on getting through the lecture. Professor Miller, now visibly frustrated, turned back to the board and wiped away the work Marcus had just done. "Let's move on," she said briskly. "Since Marcus seems so eager to contribute, I assume he won't mind another challenge." Marcus blinked, surprised. Was this a setup? Another test? He stood again, walking up to the front, already sensing what was happening. Professor Miller was setting him up to fail this time, not just to test his knowledge, but to put him on display, to embarrass him in front of everyone. She was pushing him beyond the bounds of the class, trying to prove that no matter how talented he was, there was always a limit. As she began writing another, much more complex equation on the board, Marcus exhaled slowly. He knew exactly what was happening, but he wasn't about to back down. Professor Miller finished writing the long equation, a challenge that spanned nearly half of the board. This problem was much more complex than anything they had covered in class so far, a combination of integrals, limits, and differential equations, with a particularly tricky differential component designed to trip students up. The difficulty alone made it clear that she didn't expect Marcus to solve it. She expected him to falter, to get tangled in the math, to show the class that even the most gifted student could stumble. When she turned to face him, her lips curled into a small, tight smile, one that barely concealed her confidence. "Since you seem so sure of yourself, how about you solve this one?" Marcus glanced at the equation. His mind immediately began running through the steps, identifying the parts he needed to focus on, the patterns that would guide him. He wasn't intimidated. This wasn't a normal question. He knew exactly what Professor Miller was doing. She was testing his ability to perform under pressure, to see if he could keep his cool when it really mattered.
She wanted him to crack. She wanted him to hesitate, to show weakness in front of the class. But Marcus wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. He took a slow breath, stood up, and made his way back to the board. A few students chuckled under their breath, clearly expecting him to struggle. Professor Miller's smirk deepened as she crossed her arms, folding them over her chest. "Take your time," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Marcus didn't need time. Time was a luxury that he didn't need when he could already see the solution in his mind. He picked up the chalk, his grip firm but relaxed, and began writing. Each symbol, each number, flowed from his mind to the board effortlessly, like he was simply transcribing the solution his brain had already worked out. His movements were smooth and controlled, deliberate. The students' murmurs died down. The only sound was the steady scratch of chalk against the board as Marcus worked, the weight of the room pressing in on him. But he didn't feel the pressure. He thrived in this environment. He was in control. He wasn't just solving equations, he was playing a game, and he knew the rules better than anyone in the room. A few minutes into solving the equation, Professor Miller's smile began to fade. She stood off to the side, arms still crossed, watching intently. She could see the way Marcus worked, without hesitation, without a second thought. Each step he took was calculated and precise, and it was clear to her that he wasn't just solving the problem, but doing it with a level of elegance that most students would never achieve. Marcus glanced at her, catching her eyes for a split second, but he didn't waver. He kept going, making quick but accurate simplifications, transforming the equation with a speed and efficiency that most people couldn't match. At one point, he paused for just a second, his hand hovering over the chalkboard as he processed the next step in his head. Then, without missing a beat, he moved forward, completing the problem with the same effortless grace. The entire class was silent now, every student watching him, some in awe, others with disbelief. Even the ones who had expected him to fail couldn't help but stare, their jaws slightly ajar as Marcus continued to solve the complex problem in front of him. He finished the equation and underlined the final answer. He stepped back from the board and turned to face the class. His expression was neutral, calm, but his posture was one of quiet confidence. The room remained silent for a few long seconds, but this silence wasn't the usual tension that followed a difficult question. This time, it was the kind of silence that happened when a room full of people realized they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Finally, from the back of the room, a low whistle escaped from one of the students. It broke the stillness, and soon the murmurs began. The students who had been skeptical were now leaning forward, looking at the board, processing what had just happened. Marcus had solved it, not just correctly, but with ease. It was like he had made it look too simple, too effortless.
Professor Miller's expression was unreadable, but Marcus could see the way her jaw tightened. She was searching for any small mistake, any flaw in his work, something she could use to dismiss him. But there was nothing. His solution was flawless, clean, efficient, and elegant. Her lips pressed together, and for a moment, Marcus thought she might try to brush it off. But before she could speak, one of the students raised their hand from the second row, his voice tentative but insistent. "If he got it right," Brian said, his voice carrying across the room, "shouldn't that mean Daniel just solved a graduate-level problem? Doesn't that count for something?" The question hung in the air, and a few students nodded in agreement. Professor Miller's lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time that day, Marcus saw her hesitate. He had just outclassed her in front of everyone, and now she had to decide how to handle it. "I never said it was impossible," she responded finally, her voice tight. "I only said it would be difficult for an undergraduate." There was a subtle shift in the room. The students who had been skeptical of Marcus were now looking at him differently. They had seen the problem for what it was: difficult, complex, and challenging. But Marcus had solved it like it was just another puzzle, another challenge to conquer. Professor Miller's posture had stiffened, and Marcus could see the internal struggle in her eyes. She wanted to claim that it wasn't a big deal, that he had simply gotten lucky, but there was no denying the truth. She had been wrong. Marcus had proven that he wasn't just another student in her class. He was someone who could handle the toughest challenges with ease. Still, Professor Miller wasn't going to let it go so easily. "Well," she said, her voice softening just a bit, "I think Mr. Taylor would benefit from an academic challenge." The words didn't quite sound like praise, more like a reluctant acknowledgement of a skill. She glanced at him for a moment, and in that brief exchange, she could see the respect building, though she would never admit it aloud. "Maybe a little competition would help," she added, now with a thin, calculated smile. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Competition?" he asked. Professor Miller walked to her desk, pulling out a thick, worn textbook. She flipped through the pages with purpose, before stopping on a section near the back. She turned the book around, showing the class a set of equations from an advanced graduate-level course. "This," she said, tapping a particularly intimidating problem on the page, "is something I wouldn't expect any undergraduate to solve. But since you seem so confident, Mr. Taylor, why don't you prove it?"
The murmur of students rippled through the room. Some leaned forward in their seats, eager to see how Marcus would respond. Others exchanged glances, sensing that something big was about to happen.
Marcus exhaled slowly. He knew exactly what Professor Miller was doing now. She wasn't testing his skills anymore. This was a power move. She was pushing him beyond his limits, trying to see if he would break under the pressure. If he failed, it wouldn't just be in front of his classmates. It would be in front of professors and graduate students. He could walk away. He didn't need to prove anything. But Marcus also knew that if he backed down now, she would use it as a way to confirm her doubts about him. She would make sure the world remembered him as nothing more than a student who got lucky once. No, Marcus wasn't going to let that happen. "Fine," he said, standing up. The challenge was on. As Marcus stood there in front of the class, the weight of the challenge loomed over him. The pressure was undeniable. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, waiting to see if he would crack. This wasn't just another math problem. It was a test of his composure, his ability to perform under extreme pressure, and perhaps most importantly, his ability to outsmart Professor Miller in a public setting. Professor Miller handed him the textbook with an air of finality, her fingers brushing against his as she passed it over. Her eyes gleamed with something close to triumph, like she believed she had finally set him up for failure. He didn't even look at the page. Marcus had already memorized the problem, already seen the structure in his mind. This wasn't a random challenge for him. It was a puzzle, a game. And games, especially ones like this, were exactly what he thrived on. He walked to the front of the room, taking his place at the chalkboard. The audience around him shifted restlessly, murmurs growing as they speculated whether he could really solve this complex graduate-level problem. Marcus didn't need to respond to them. He had already made his decision. He was going to prove Professor Miller wrong, prove that he was more than just the sum of his undergraduate status. The problem in front of him was intricate. It sprawled across the page, a dense network of integrals, differential equations, and exponential functions. Each term seemed more complicated than the last. Marcus took a slow breath and glanced briefly at the class. Some of the students, including Brian from earlier, were watching him with newfound respect. Others, especially the more skeptical ones, were waiting for him to slip up. But Marcus wasn't worried about their expectations. He focused instead on the symbols, the patterns, and the solution that was already forming in his mind. He picked up the chalk. His movements were deliberate, controlled, and steady as he began working through the problem. He didn't rush. Each symbol flowed naturally from one to the next as his brain worked faster than his hand could write. He didn't second-guess himself. He trusted the process, the same process that had carried him through countless problems in the past. As he solved the equation, he could hear the faint whispers of his classmates behind him. The sounds grew quieter as the complexity of the problem became apparent to them. Marcus kept his focus, each calculation building on the last, like a puzzle falling into place.
Professor Miller stood at the back of the room, her arms still crossed, her lips pressed together in a tight line. She hadn't spoken a word since she handed him the problem, but Marcus could feel her eyes burning into him, waiting for him to falter, waiting for the moment when he would make a mistake. But there would be no mistakes. The murmurs from the class had died down to a soft hum as he worked through the problem. The weight of expectation in the room had shifted. What had started as a challenge designed to humiliate him now felt more like an opportunity to showcase his ability, his confidence, and his calm under pressure. With a final, decisive stroke of chalk, Marcus boxed the last part of the equation. He set the chalk down on the tray, his hands steady, and turned around to face the class. The room was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. Marcus didn't smile, didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He had done what was required. He had solved the problem. He had proven, once again, that he was capable of much more than Professor Miller had expected. For a moment, no one spoke. The class sat in stunned silence,
their eyes flicking between Marcus's work on the board and their professor. What had just happened? How had he managed to solve the problem with such precision and clarity? Then, from the back of the room, a low whistle broke the silence, followed by the sound of students shifting in their seats. A few of them exchanged looks, clearly impressed by what they had just witnessed. Marcus could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the room was looking at him now, not as a quiet student who kept to himself, but as someone with real talent, someone who belonged here in a space full of elite minds. Professor Miller stood still, her jaw clenched, her eyes scanning Marcus's work line by line, searching for any flaw. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't frowning, her face was unreadable. But Marcus knew what she was doing. She was looking for any way to dismiss him, to maintain the control she had always had in the classroom. But there was nothing. For a long time, the room remained silent, and Marcus could feel the eyes of his classmates, their expectations, the weight of the challenge he had just completed. Finally, Professor Miller exhaled sharply through her nose, her lips curling into a tight smile. "Well," she said, her voice colder than before, "it seems you managed to solve the problem. Congratulations." A few students exchanged glances. There was no applause, no genuine acknowledgement, just the sense that the room had shifted, that something had changed. But Marcus didn't care about that. He wasn't looking for approval. He was looking for truth, and he had just made it undeniable. He returned to his seat without a word. His heart was steady, his breathing even, but he could feel the eyes on him. Some were impressed, some were irritated. Probably the ones who had expected him to fail, who had hoped to see him fall. But Marcus didn't need their approval. He had proven something far more important.
Professor Miller turned back to the board and wiped away his work with a swift motion. She tried to regain control of the room, but there was no denying it. The power dynamics had shifted. The class was looking at her differently now, just as much as they had been looking at Marcus. Her voice regained some of its usual edge, but it lacked the same authority it had at the beginning of the lecture. "Let's move on," she said briskly, turning back to the class as though nothing had happened. "Since Marcus is so eager to contribute, I assume he won't mind another challenge." But Marcus didn't respond. He had already done what he came to do. He had proven he could solve the toughest problems. He had proved to himself that he was more than capable, and that was enough for him. The challenge was far from over, though. As Professor Miller finished scribbling a new problem on the board, she turned back toward Marcus, who was now seated quietly, arms crossed and eyes watching her closely. Her voice, though still crisp, had lost some of its earlier force. "If you're so confident, Mr. Taylor," she said, forcing a smile, "how about we raise the stakes a little bit?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Students who had been listening intently began to shift in their seats, sensing that something was about to go down. Marcus sat still, his gaze never leaving Professor Miller's face. He could feel the tension building in the room, the silent expectation of what was coming next. He knew she was testing him, not just his math skills, but his ability to handle pressure in front of everyone. Professor Miller walked to her desk, retrieving a thick textbook. She flipped through the pages with careful precision before stopping in the middle of the book. The students' eyes widened as they watched her turn the textbook toward the class, revealing dense, graduate-level equations that none of them had seen before. It was no longer about basic calculus or even advanced undergraduate topics. This was something designed to trip Marcus up. "This," she said, tapping on the page, "is a problem from an advanced graduate-level course, something I wouldn't expect an undergraduate to be able to solve. But since you've done so well today, Mr. Taylor, why don't you prove me wrong?" A few students gasped. Others whispered under their breath. The murmurs escalated and the room buzzed with excitement and disbelief. This was it, the moment where Marcus would either sink or swim in front of everyone. Professor Miller was betting on him failing, and the class was waiting to see if she would be right. Marcus's mind whirred as he glanced at the problem. He already knew what she was doing. She was testing him, yes, but she was also setting him up to fail.
If he cracked under the pressure, it would be a victory for her, a chance to show that, despite all the talent he had displayed earlier, he wasn't ready for the real challenge. But Marcus wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. He stood up again, his movements calm and controlled. His heart rate was steady. This wasn't just about math anymore, it was personal. Professor Miller had tried to push him to the edge, to embarrass him in front of his peers, but he wasn't going to let that happen.
He walked to the front of the room and took the textbook from her, flipping through the pages to the problem she had pointed out. As he skimmed it, he knew he could solve it. He had seen problems like this before. Complicated, yes, but not impossible. He wasn't worried about the math itself. He was worried about how this was going to play out in front of an audience that was already questioning his every move. He took the chalk from the tray, and once again, the room grew quiet. It was as if the whole class was holding its breath, waiting for him to fail. Marcus glanced over his shoulder at Professor Miller, who stood by the desk, arms crossed and watching him intently. Her gaze was sharp, calculating. She was waiting for him to make a mistake. But Marcus wasn't concerned with her. He was focused on the problem in front of him. The equation sprawled across the board, packed with complex integrals, differential components, and limits. He knew the first step, the second, and the third. He could visualize the entire solution in his mind. But he didn't rush. He worked carefully, breaking down the problem into smaller steps, simplifying each part with the precision he had honed over years of practice. The chalk scratched against the board, the only sound in the room. As Marcus worked, the tension in the air thickened. The whispers of his classmates faded as they realized he wasn't just writing, it was happening. He was solving the problem. The whispers turned to complete silence, the room fixated on his every move. Professor Miller stood rigid, arms still crossed, lips pressed tightly together. Her eyes darted back and forth between Marcus's work on the board and the students who were watching him. She was looking for any mistake, any misstep she could pounce on. But there was nothing. Marcus had solved the problem. He had done it without hesitation, without any sign of doubt. As he reached the final steps, his chalk hand moved swiftly, almost automatically. It was like a dance. Each move flowed from the last, each simplification building on the previous one. The solution was starting to come together in a way that seemed almost effortless. Finally, Marcus boxed the last part of the equation, underlining the final answer. He set the chalk down, turned to face the class, and waited. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening. Every student in the room was staring at the board, processing what had just happened. Professor Miller didn't move. She stood frozen, her jaw clenched, her expression unreadable. Marcus met her gaze, but he didn't smile, he didn't gloat, he didn't need to. He had done what she thought he couldn't do, and that was enough. Then a voice broke the silence. One of the students in the back, Brian, who had spoken up earlier, muttered a low laugh. "No way," Brian said, shaking his head in disbelief. "He actually did it." Marcus could feel the shift in the room. The whispers began again, but this time they weren't skeptical. They were impressed. He had just solved a graduate-level problem in front of a class that had been eager to see him fail.
Professor Miller finally spoke, her voice tight and strained. "You skipped a step," she said, trying to regain control of the room, trying to find something, anything to discredit Marcus's solution. Marcus didn't react immediately. He simply glanced at her, then turned back to the board. "No, I didn't," he said evenly. "You're referring to the step where I simplified the partial fraction decomposition, right?" Professor Miller's fingers curled into a fist, and she didn't respond immediately. Her gaze was fixed on him, her frustration building. She wasn't used to being wrong, especially not in front of her students. Marcus continued,
his voice casual but confident. "I didn't skip it. I just did the calculation mentally because it was straightforward. If you'd like, I can write it out, step by step." The class was dead silent. Professor Miller's face tightened, but she didn't say anything. Her grip on the desk betrayed her frustration. Finally, she inhaled sharply. "No, that won't be necessary." The energy in the room had shifted dramatically. Students exchanged glances, some nodding in silent approval, others simply stunned by what had just unfolded. Marcus hadn't just solved the problem, he had turned the tables on Professor Miller. She turned back to her desk, setting the textbook down harder than necessary, her frustration palpable. But Marcus didn't care. He wasn't looking for an apology or validation. He had done what she hadn't expected, and in doing so, he had proven something far more important, that sometimes the best way to change people's minds isn't through words, it's through undeniable truth. The tension in the room lingered for a few moments after Marcus returned to his seat. Professor Miller tried to resume the lecture, but it was clear that something had shifted. Her usual authoritative tone was a little less sharp now. She was still moving through the material, but her words lacked the edge they'd had at the beginning of the class. Marcus sat back, arms folded, his gaze steady as he watched her from the corner of his eye. His classmates were still processing what had just happened, but Marcus wasn't looking for approval anymore. The truth had been laid out for everyone to see. He had solved the problem not just with skill, but with ease, and that was more than enough for him. But Professor Miller wasn't done with him yet. She could feel the shift, feel the eyes of her students on her, waiting for her next move. She was trying to regain control, trying to turn the situation back in her favor. But it wasn't going to be that easy. The rest of the lecture passed in a blur for Marcus. He half listened as Professor Miller continued to lecture, her voice now more mechanical than commanding. He could sense that she was simmering, still trying to reconcile what had just happened. For the rest of the class, it was clear that the balance of power had changed. Finally, the bell rang, signaling the end of class. As the students began to gather their things, Professor Miller hesitated before turning to face the class. She cleared her throat, and the room fell silent once again.
"I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the results of yesterday's symposium," she began, her voice more composed but still carrying the weight of what had happened. Marcus Taylor took first place in a competition against some of the best mathematical minds in the country. A few students clapped hesitantly, some of them still processing everything that had transpired. Marcus didn't move, didn't react. He wasn't looking for praise from Professor Miller. He had already proven what he needed to prove. This moment, this acknowledgement, meant more than any words of approval she could offer. Professor Miller continued, her gaze briefly landing on Marcus before she looked back at the class. "That is no small achievement," she said, her voice level. "But it doesn't mean that the work ends here. Marcus, you've earned my respect for your work. However, the road ahead will be just as demanding, if not more." With that, she turned back to the board, clearly trying to regain the authority she'd lost during the class. Marcus watched her, feeling a sense of closure that he hadn't expected. It wasn't the praise he had wanted, it was the recognition, the acknowledgement of his skill and talent that spoke louder than anything else. Brian, who had been watching the exchange from the back of the room, turned to Marcus with a grin. "Dude, you totally flipped the script on her. I didn't think she'd ever give you any credit, but look at that. You've got her respect, whether she wants to admit it or not." Marcus smiled slightly, shaking his head. "It's not about respect. It's about proving I belong here. Proving that what I've done and what I'm capable of speaks for itself." The students slowly filed out of the classroom, still talking amongst themselves, some of them still processing everything that had transpired. Marcus had solved the graduate-level problem and how he had handled the pressure. No one seemed to expect it, and yet he had risen to the challenge and done it with ease. As Marcus walked out of the lecture hall, He could feel the weight of the moment settling in. He wasn't just another student in a class anymore. He had changed the narrative. He had silenced the doubts not just in Professor Miller's mind, but in the minds of everyone who had underestimated him. Walking down the hallway, Marcus pulled out his phone and checked the time. He had a lot of work ahead of him. Homework to catch up on, other exams to prepare for, and a symposium to get ready for. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't just going through the motions. He was moving forward, proving that he could face any challenge that came his way and come out on top. He had been tested, and he had won. But more than that, he had proven to himself that no one, no matter how authoritative or confident they seemed, could define his limits.
As he flipped open a notebook and began working through another problem, a familiar thought crossed his mind. It wasn't just about solving math problems. It was about solving the problems that others put in front of him. Problems that told him he couldn't do it, that told him he wasn't enough. Every challenge he overcame was another reminder that the only person who could truly hold him back was himself. He had already won the battle. Now, he was ready for the next one. Lessons learned. The story of Marcus Taylor and Professor Miller offers powerful life lessons about resilience, self-confidence, and the importance of standing up for yourself in challenging situations. One key takeaway is that confidence in your abilities is crucial, even when others doubt you. Marcus was never the loudest student in the room, but when the stakes were high, he trusted his skills and proved his worth. This story reminds us that challenges, especially those that come from unexpected sources, can become opportunities to showcase our strengths and grow. Marcus didn't seek validation from others, nor did he need to prove himself to anyone other than himself. In life, it's important to remember that success isn't always about external praise, but about knowing you've done your best and standing firm in your abilities. Another important lesson is that perseverance under pressure leads to true growth. Marcus thrived in the face of adversity, showing that our true potential is often unlocked when we face challenges head-on.
If you found this video helpful or thought-provoking, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. It really helps more people discover our content. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest updates from our channel. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next videos.